right. So a little bit about me. I will not go through this entire list, I promise. So I have 18 years of government grant application, grant management, and grant compliance experience. I'm a former CDC public health analyst, and I've managed federal grants for a number of organizations, at universities, not nonprofits, large and small. And I used to be a fiscal consultant during site visits of state agencies. So state agencies, of course, also get federal grants. They also have to endure monitoring visits. And so GrantsWorks is one of the firms hired to actually conduct site monitoring visits and prepare site visit reports for HRSA, known as the Health Resources Services Administration. So quite a bit of grant experience. I will let Alice describe her, of course, introduce herself in a little bit more detail and provide some more information on her background.
Thank you, Patrice. As Patrice said, I'm Alice Dicko, and I have been writing grants for a long time, actually 30 years now. A majority of my experience has been in healthcare, particularly federally qualified health centers, behavioral health, and other public health sectors. I have been successful in securing grants from a variety of funders, but most particularly the NIH, HRSA, and SAMHSA. And I also do review for HRSA and SAMHSA several times a year.
Awesome. So if you're like probably everyone in the country right now, you're shaking, you're scratching your head, you're wondering what is going on, in terms of a lot of changes that are happening, but also certainly what does federal grant writing look like today? How should we be positioning our organizations for federal grants? Well, that's what we are going to help you, figure out today. But one of the first things I'd like for you all to let us know, if this is you or your organization, are you confused about the status of federal grant funding? And I think I will even raise my hand on that one. Are you unsure about how to position your organization for federal grants? If you can drop your comments in the chat, say yes, yes, I certainly am, raise your hand. However you'd like to let us know. Are you even reconsidering applying for federal grant funding? Are you thinking, well, I'm not even sure what this landscape looks like. I'm going to turn my attention to only the private sector for funding. And quite frankly, can your organization only rely on the private sector for funding, or maybe also local and state government grants, which interestingly, and please be aware of this, many state and local government grants are federally sourced. So just want to make sure you guys are aware of that. Are you waiting in limbo for information about your existing grants? All right. So just want to make sure we ask the question, find out where you guys are, because I know that many of you have these feelings. And again, I go back to this picture of this woman who looks confused, forlorn, wondering what to do next. Again, our webinar will hopefully help you understand a little bit more. So this is what we're going to cover. We're going to cover a brief overview of the funding freeze. Just a brief overview of that. We've actually done a webinar in January, providing much more detail. I've actually written a number of LinkedIn newsletters. For those of you who don't know, we have a LinkedIn newsletter called Federal Grant Insights. So you can find that there. We're going to talk about new funding priorities, how grant writers will need to structure. I didn't know if I was... Am I muted still? Okay, nope. Good. How grant writers will need to structure proposals, essential updates on changes to federal grant writing in 2025, and practical strategies to refine your grant writing and ensure you're prepared for what's ahead. So we're going to start off, though, again, talking a little bit about navigating the federal grant freezes and budget cuts, because, so we just want to make sure we do that. We're going to start off with a poll. Passion, one of our team members, is going to launch a poll. There he is. We would love to know, how familiar are you with recent federal funding shifts? And we're seeing the responses coming in. Okay, great. So far, we're seeing somewhat aware leading the pack with 62%, very familiar at 26%. It's gone up to 28%. And then, of course, not familiar at all at 12%. And that's about 5 of you. So please, yeah, I don't think we have all the, not everyone has voted. So if you can please let us know so we can close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so there are the results. Again, 59% of you, that's the one that's still winning, somewhat aware. 28% very familiar, and of course, 13% not familiar at all. So I thank you so much, Passion, for launching the poll. And now we're going to talk a little bit about understanding the changing federal grant landscape. I'm going to turn it over to Alice, who has, a really great perspective on this as both a writer, reviewer, and, of course, internally, our team has been talking about these changes and keeping each other abreast. So Alice, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Patrice. So, as I said earlier, this is based on what we also are hearing about federal funding trends and industry talk. And although the final policies certainly are still unfolding, what we do know is organizations should prepare for stricter outcome-driven expectations, perhaps a reduced tolerance for what we could consider politically sensitive language. And I guess what I would like people to think about, this isn't about writing stronger proposals per se. It's about completely reframing how we prove need, how we prove impact, and how we position our organizations for sustainability. It's not just a change, but likely a new era in grant funding, or at least certainly federal grant funding. The concern is for those of us who don't strategically adapt that we're going to be ones behind while others secure resources. So as Patrice has mentioned, we all do know that there is a funding freeze right now, and it is uncertain what agencies will be in terms of the proposals that will be released coming forward. That is still unclear. What we do hear is that funding priorities are shifting away more towards economic growth, job creation, and infrastructure, where programs that focus on social services, education, certainly the environment, are either face deep cuts or will be facing deep cuts. So what we're going to be talking about is some ways to consider how to restructure possibly your applications, and just to think about proposals and what opportunities are worth your organization's time going forward. Next slide, please, Patrice. So we're going to talk about then versus now. Previously, a lot of us assumed that when we secured a grant that we would be relatively assured of a multi-year renewal, or that the same notice of grant opportunity might be available in the following year or years. Social government funding for social services and research was generally stable and bipartisan, that these programs have often been around for many, many years, and that funding was passed through relatively easily, and that proposals were focused on impact rather than proving cost effectiveness. Now it's a bit different landscape. Next slide, please, Patrice. So certainly the funding's less predictable. We don't know what is going to be left in existence once these cuts are, or these departments, I should say, which are being reviewed right now by the federal government, what's going to be left. What we do here is going to be the new normal, is that federal agencies are going to be reviewing proposals much more strictly and expecting clear cost efficiency and return on investment. The other issue that we will be focusing on is sustainability. For federal proposals in the past, sustainability, although it is often part of the proposal, is not as scrutinized as we anticipate that it will be. And In this respect, it will be best to evaluate if it's even possible for you to sustain your program before submitting an application. So we'll be talking a little bit about what that means going forward with sustainability. Next slide, please, Patrice. So in practicality, what does this mean? One thing is that we encourage you to stop relying on federal renewals. As I just said, the guarantee of having 3 5-year applications and renewals is likely to be changing. For those who have been relying solely on federal funding, the time has never been stronger to develop a mix of state, corporate, and private foundation funding. One of the things that will become more pivotal is tying your project, regardless of what it is, to meet economic and workforce priorities of the government. We'll be talking about framing programs in terms of job creation, business growth, workforce development, or very practical, cost-effective things that can be measured. And with that being said, that we will need to be able to show return on investment and essentially viewing grants more as a business case. Next slide, please, Patrice. So I think many of you probably have heard that one of the things that is happening right now is that certain keywords are being flagged or in certain cases banned from showing up in grant proposals. So what does this mean? Next slide, please. The language must change. And if you move forward, we can start talking about exactly what that means. Certain keywords we are hearing may flag reviewers or the grant funding organizations from perhaps even rejecting your proposals full out, especially if it shows up in the title. At the very least, it may decrease your likelihood of funding. So we're going to talk now about some thoughts about how you start to navigate these flag phrases. Next slide, please. So what I ask you to consider is, although the list of flagged words or key phrases is not complete, we are hearing some trickle out. And one of the big ones that I think many of us have heard about is the word equity has become somewhat, if not totally, taboo to say. So how do you go about addressing this when your proposal certainly will, in most cases, conclude a lot of these types of terms that are flagged? We have to think about literally how to rephrase things. So for example, equity may be better stated as access to opportunities or fair resource distribution. Diversity and inclusion might now be considered broad community engagement or multi-stakeholder participation. Gender, which is an interesting one and one that I think all of us at some point will have to address, takes on the term demographic representation or population-specific support. Racism, historical barriers to opportunity, social justice, community-led reform efforts, trauma-informed care, resilience-focused programming, and cultural competency, community-centered approach. These are by no means exhaustive, but this is to give you a sense of how one may start to need to think about how to take some of these terms and still be able to convey your mission or convey your program without getting flagged. Next slide, please, Patrice. So that is setting the stage for the fact that once you find some ways to address some of these keywords, we're going to have to think about how to really convey need in today's funding climate. So the need section has always been important for a grant proposal, but under new federal policies, it is very, very likely that funders are going to demand data-backed, urgent, and highly specific problem statements, and that the programs that you're putting forward must very, very closely align with the federal priorities to get funding. So what does that mean? Next slide, please, Patrice. Previously, a strong narrative could often be uh, portrayed with general statistics on a social issue, um, often were enough to justify need. A lot of the issues when we're talking about in social science are very broad and maybe even hard to quantify. So, as I said, general stats and data were often sufficient. And that funders, more importantly, looked at broader community impact than absolutely specific alignment with federal funding priorities. That likely will change. Um, Vague statements will no longer work. Often we are encouraging people to think along uh, economic justifications. What financial burden might be reduced by funding the program, or what cost savings might be incurred by the government or by a social service agency or a state. Next slide, please. So how would that be done? Use localized hard data. Instead of saying something like, our community faces a literacy crisis, uh, the level of specificity becomes much more clear. In blank, 42% of adults have literacy level below the national average, impacting workforce development and costing the economy X amount annually, is how this might be more effectively portrayed in this current funding climate. Quantifying the cost of inaction, although challenging, is also another area that we ask that you consider addressing, and that to tie to economic priorities for the federal government. So, for example, if you are talking about education and the example that we've given on literacy, it would be looking at how we could impact how literacy rates will impact workforce readiness and economic growth. That is to say that literacy for the sake of literacy as an outcome may not be sufficient, that we have to take it one or two steps further to indicate how it's going to impact, as I said, workforce readiness or job growth or things of that nature. Next slide, please. So once we've addressed need, then we have to talk about outcomes. And so the outcome section, again, will need to become much more quantifiable. And so with that, I believe we have another poll coming up. So currently, what is your biggest challenge with writing grant outcomes? And have you encouraged flag language issues in federal grant applications yet? So for a lot of you, you are unsure and have not yet had the flag language becoming a challenge, but that a lot of you are indicating, at least 30% of you, that you're have encountered some of this challenge. So hopefully, as we continue discussing outcomes, we can figure out a way to to better state what outcomes should look like and how to avoid this flag language. And I think we can end that poll. Thank you. Next slide, please. So much like need, outcomes have always been important, but in today's landscape, they're going to need to be hyper specific, results driven, and with quantifiable impact measures. I think the biggest way to think about this is that previously funders were more flexible and even open to long-term outcomes, even if the results took years to materialize. By years, 5, 10, maybe even 15, but particularly when we're talking about some fairly intractable social issues, Funders understood that it was going to take a while to make some change. Um, General impact statements were sometimes enough, maybe in some certain cases not, but certainly no longer. Um, Especially, as I said, for systemic issues like something like community literacy. The impact in terms of being able to quantify it and quantify it quickly will become essential. Every proposal needs to demonstrate effectiveness and return on investment. Um, Again, I keep stressing this, that this should start to look more like a business case than perhaps it has in previous years. Um, how funding will reduce reliance on public assistance, create jobs, improve economic outcomes are all the things that we need to start thinking in, as opposed to, as I said, the outcome for the sake of the outcome. Outcomes that lack direct economic justification or short-term measurable success more likely now will be scrutinized very, very strongly or rejected. So again, what does this look like? A shift from broad social impact to immediate results. Before, one might say something, we aim to improve college readiness in low-income students. Now we're talking about a level of specificity and short-term outcome. Within 1 year, 75% of participants will increase SAT scores by 200 points. That's very specific. It also does make one have to think, as they're writing the proposal, how are we going to be able to measure these things? And we'll be talking a little bit about that later. We strongly suggest you think along the lines of financial impact. Um, Before, if you, for example, had a job training program, you might emphasize the skill building alone, that somebody would learn certain traits or certain characteristics. Now we're talking about proving taxpayer savings, something like a statement: for every $1 invested, this program saves 3 in public assistance. Short-term benchmarks are critical. Again, for some of these issues, and very understandably so, they are long-term that we tend to see outcomes. So before, we might have said over 5 years, this initiative will strengthen literacy in the community. Now we're talking within 6 months, 80% of students will demonstrate 1 full grade level of reading improvement, or something to that effect. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked about outcomes, let's talk about sustainability. I know, certainly for myself in the private sector with foundations, that sustainability over the last several years has become more critical. And as I said previously, that although there has always been some nod to sustainability in for many funders, it will be scrutinized at a completely different level. Next slide, please. So, with that being said, let's take another poll. How confident are you in your organization's current sustainability strategy? Okay, it's trending very, very much towards somewhat confident. Very few of you are feeling very confident, and a fair amount of you are feeling not so confident. So, with that being said, let's take a look at what that means in terms of going forward. Next slide, please. As I said, we're talking about a whole new level of emphasis for the federal proposals now. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, often federal grants were subject frequently to renewals, and often the renewals were reliable and recurring, um, often reducing the urgency for alternative sustainability planning. Most of us thought we'd have 2, 3, maybe even 5 years to develop that as we went along. Now, I urge you all to think of federal funding as a springboard, not a safety net. Treat it like you would venture capital. It's there to launch your initiative, but not sustain it indefinitely. And that is a very different shift for some organizations. Next slide, please. Um, as I've said several times before, federal renewals are no longer guaranteed. And in your applications, it will be necessary to demonstrate that you can survive without future federal funds. Again, diversified revenue streams are now a necessity, not a luxury. Federal funders will become much more likely to support organizations with a mix of funding sources as opposed to showing the federal government as a sole source funder. And that in certain proposals, cost cutting and efficiency models must be included. They want to see, they will be wanting to see lean, resourceful operations. And again, as many of you have heard, that also will be demonstrated that indirect costs are likely going to be capped for many organizations or lower. And so some acknowledgement of where an organization can be resourceful will be recommended. Next slide, please. So obviously, the next thing we need to talk about is developing multiple funding streams, uh, whether they're state or local. And as Patrice said, often that money has come down through a federal pass-through, so it'll be unclear what kinds of restrictions we'll be seeing now on state funding. But local and corporate funding and earned income sources will need to exist alongside federal funding. Um, Things to consider if this would be appropriate for your organization is consider membership-based funding, fee-for-service models, corporate sponsorships. Again, for those of you who have not gotten into this arena, this is the time to significantly and seriously start exploring these avenues. And again, business, treat this as a business case that you are showing the funders. Funders want to see ROI now, not just impact. Okay, so how do we reduce reliance on federal renewals? I think we can move on to the next slide. We've talked a lot about that federal funders will be reducing most likely their renewals. So we urge you to think of federal funding as a leverage point, but not to be depended on. Organizations that will show diversified funding portfolios will definitely become more competitive for grants. And the sustainability plan in your proposals will need to be very well articulated and clear to show the sustainability of your program beyond the duration of, I would recommend beyond the duration of year one funding if you have a multi-year grant. In that, again, leveraging other types of funders with your federal money will be an important consideration to show in your federal proposal. Next slide, please. So practically, what did this look like? I'm sure a lot of you already use a lot of this language, but as an example, how do you indicate that you're leveraging federal funds? As an example, we'll leverage our existing federal funding to secure a one-in-one match from private foundations. Expand state and local government applications. Again, local workforce money, for example, that might align with the job training program that would have been previously funded by federal dollars. And uh, long-term corporate partnerships. Many businesses do invest in community-based initiatives as part of corporate social responsibility. So we would encourage you to work alongside corporate funders to say something like this. We'll establish an annual sponsorship program where corporations can fund specific program elements in exchange for recognition and engagement opportunities. Next slide, please. So that concludes the portion of my uh, talk that focuses on very specific strategies that we are suggesting or encouraging to think about. I know Patrice is going to provide a little bit more clarity about GrantsWorks, and then we'll open up for questions.
Great. So hi, everyone. My name is Patrice Davis. For those of you who didn't join at the top of the webinar, first of all, I'd love to just thank Alice for all this wonderful information that she's sharing with everyone. Please hang out. Please stay with us. She's going to be answering some of your questions. Now's the time to put your questions in the chat. Again, please put hashtag in front of the questions so we know which ones to really hone in on and be able to, see those questions. So one of the things I want to speak about really quickly is about, of course, achieving federal grant management clarity. We at GrantsWorks, this is something that we focus on quite a bit because we are both pre and post award specialists. So we can help you, of course, get the award, but then once you receive it, we also emphasize and partner with our clients to make sure that they can keep those grants. So we build the systems that they need in order to be able to keep those grants. So we're paying very close attention to things that are going to be coming from the Office of Management and Budget that may impact the way that grants are managed. Now, we all know that uniform guidance was many of the changes that were released in April of last year became effective October 1, 2024, just 4 to 5 months ago. I'm not expecting any changes immediately, but there may be some minor changes in uniform guidance. I do want to point out a couple of things. So remember, I just want to remind you all that both local and state government grants could be federally sourced. So a lot of the things that that we're talking about today, you definitely want to keep that in mind, even for those local and state government grants, even though it's going to be reviewed by the local or state government official. We want to make sure that what they report up to the federal agency, if it is indeed pass-through funding, aligns with the federal government's funding objectives. So a lot of the workforce grants, many of them are federally sourced, such as the WIOA grants. I think it's the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity. I think that's what it stands for. Those are federally sourced grants from the U.S. Department of Labor. So just want to make sure you guys are aware of that. So one great thing that she said a lot of great things, but one thing that stuck out to me was around the indirect costs being potentially capped. I did actually see an announcement from that potentially NIH is going to be capping its indirect costs as 15%. Now, obviously, that's in alignment with the current de minimis rate that has been increased to 15%. But many of you know that, small business innovation research grants and, grants typically have, there are other things that are in the budget and even indirect costs above that threshold that are sometimes in your awards. So I just want to make sure you're aware of what has been announced, whether or not that's official policy yet. I'm not certain, but I just want to make sure you know that we're paying attention to those things that are going to be affecting you for your grant applications, but also for post-award. I do want to always stress that, whenever you have any challenges with managing your federal grant, administering that grant, in other words, you've received the grant and now you're ready to, of course, implement the program, to always consider the, expertise of a federal grant management consulting firm. And that's what we are. Federal grant consulting firm. A lot of organizations, they reach out to us and they say, well, we hired our grant writer to manage the federal grant. Your grant writer, unless he or she has grant management experience, may not have the expertise needed to make sure you comply with your grant, because there are compliance elements that you need to make sure are factored into your oversight of your award. So as I mentioned earlier, I have a newsletter, a LinkedIn newsletter called Federal Grant Insights. You can grab that on LinkedIn. Please take a look at it. Quite a few articles, including an overview of the many of the changes that have been released just in the past month. It's hard to believe it's just been a month. Today's February 20th. The new administration came in on January 20th. So yes, it's been a month. Of course, seems like it's been so many, much longer. I do want to briefly talk about the Federal Grant Management Preparedness Program. This is a 4-part program that we help basically, ensure our clients have the capacity to be able to manage their grants. It starts with discovery, and then we support them we provide a lot of implementation support. We strengthen their ability to manage their grants and, effectively through training and by the development of policies and procedures, which are still required as of today. And then we, of course, make sure that they have reinforcements in place. And I just, this is something that we find has been really, really beneficial for our clients to, make sure that they come in, get the support they need, and then can, of course, independently manage their grants if that's what they decide to do. So what do? We prepare grant research reports. We provide grant writing services. We manage your grants. We help you establish the infrastructure needed to comply. We create compliance roadmaps. We help you develop subrecipient monitoring and management processes and tools. We make sure you're prepared for site visits and your audits. We've been getting a lot more requests for single audit preparedness support. And so thankfully, that has been really helping our clients as well. We train your team. That's both in person and online training. And again, we help you develop the required policies and procedures that you need. Okay. So the impact of recent executive orders, as of today, we're seeing that many of the court orders, aren't really being adhered to. We know that the grants authorized by the Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there's still quite a bit of restriction, I'll use that word, on those. And that, as you all may know, is hundreds of billions of dollars in awarded grants that are currently frozen. When I say 200, I say hundreds. I don't mean 100 or 200 billion. I mean about $900 billion in grants and other types of funding are up in the air and frozen because, these are two laws that were signed by the previous president. Of course, we also talked during our last presentation about NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act. That implementation is going to be impacted. And NEPA is that's a law that applies to a lot of construction grants. And basically NEPA, more than likely, the procedures that NEPA requires will likely be streamlined. And of course, we're advising our clients. So I do want to make sure then, but I do, of course, want to drop in the chat, if I can do that now, a link to, I'm going to stop sharing briefly. I want to drop in the chat a link to where you can actually schedule some time to speak with Alice or me about your grant writing needs. So let me go ahead and drop that in there. And Passion, if you can drop that in for us, please. I still have a Zoom link. There are a few people that reached out to us on email. And so I still have that Zoom link in my, that's kind of teed up. We'll drop that in the chat, but I'll go back to sharing the presentation and of course, start taking your questions. All right. There we go. All right. So here are some of our services. We're not going to go through them right now. I just want to pause here on the final slide of the, final slide of our deck. And I'm going to now go into the chat to see if I can get some of the questions that you all may have dropped in. Someone says, when citing data, are there specific sources we should use? And of course, all these questions are going to be directed to Alice, meaning, would it be okay to cite a Heritage Foundation report, but not a Brookings Foundation report? That's funny. Great question.
It is a great question.
That's a great question.
And I think that is some very creative and thoughtful thinking there. I would encourage you to use a variety of sources. And yes, in this particular case, depending on the topic, if there is support that you would find in a report from the Heritage Foundation, where before you may have received it from another source, I would add that into your citation as well as other sources. But yes, having multiple sources of information would be extremely helpful.
Okay, great. I'm gonna get some other questions here. Okay, great. Do you expect corporate slash foundation grants to become more competitive as federal funds become more scarce?
Indeed. I think it's very, very likely that everybody will be looking to private money. What I have remarked on is that funders, foundations, corporations have been remarkably silent as all this is unfolded.
Yeah.
Um, Perhaps, Patrice, you have a different perspective, but I have not heard boo from any private foundation, even at a comment about what's happening or in terms of what their response is going to be.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that, yes, I do agree that foundations have been eerily quiet. As a matter of fact, I think it was the Chronicle Philanthropy itself acknowledged that in its most one of its recent newsletters, basically saying foundations seem to be really quiet and they seem to be, bending to the
Mhm,
tone, the changing
mhm.
tone of our society. So maybe they're waiting to see what's happening. But yes, I agree with you, Alice, and we'll see what happens. We'll see if they step up to the plate a little.
And I would also just add to that is the reality is that for many organizations, corporate or private funding is just simply not enough.
It's not.
Very rarely do you find substantial awards or multi-year awards, and or they have requirements around matching funding or things like that. I by no means do not want to give the illusion that somehow private money is going to fill the void for federal money for many of you, if not all of you. But just to acknowledge that previously, if you had not looked towards it, that this is the time to start to explore it for whatever you can get out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, great point. Many of us are used to those large six-figure and maybe even seven-figure federal grants. I don't see many of those on the foundation side. So great point. Now, here's another question. Do you anticipate these changes across the board or just from specific agencies like NSF, NIH, et cetera?
Yeah, given what I have seen, and I'm sure lots of you have probably also gone on to grants.gov or gone to a federal agency and literally see grants being pulled from that website to be, I believe the word they're using is reevaluated. The other day, last week, I, in the morning, went onto the Bureau of Justice Assistance and looked at an application, and 2 hours later, every application was pulled off the website. I know in HRSA, a lot of the Ryan White funding is being evaluated. That is to say, we have heard publicly about NIH and NSF. I can only imagine that every agency will be scrutinizing their applications, that this will be across the board, that it's happened in many agencies and it is happening currently. I just this morning sat on a review panel for HRSA, so they are still reviewing the applications that have been submitted, but there has been as I said, some applications have been pulled off the website for proposals that were um, put out there in with certain categories of interest.
And to quickly add what Kristen Fody noted in here. Hi, Kristen. Nice seeing you again. I'd push back on spending too much time on corporate giving. It
Mm,
represents only 6% of total philanthropy. A lot of work for little return from most groups. Not saying don't reach out, but the last place for private philanthropy that I would approach. Now, a state agency representative, Sarah's question is for state agencies, we don't have the luxury of applying for private funding. Local government agencies can, there are different ways that they do that, but yes, we rely on renewals for grants that have been around for 20 to 30 years. What are you
yeah.
seeing in regard to state agency applications?
I have not seen anything yet. Perhaps Patrice, you could also comment on this, but yet is the pivotal word. Everybody is evaluating it now. I don't know how quickly we will have an answer to this. It is a very anxiety-filled time because we don't know. I imagine that state agencies will also show some symmetry to what the feds are doing. And as Patrice, I believe you said that a lot of times this is pass-through money, so they have restrictions on it already.
Yeah. And so for state agencies, I don't know either. One of the things though that popped into my mind is, I would, if it was me, and someone asked me to do it, one of the first things I would do is go to grants.gov, pull up an eligibility, in other words, do a search of grants, and look at the eligibility search criteria, select a state or local government agency as the eligibility, just, run the report and see what shows up. That's not the best way probably, but that's one of the things that I would do immediately just to find out what's still out there. I would even do a search by state agency and maybe the assistance listing number. There are just a number of ways you can find out what's still out there on grants.gov. But that's a very good question. By the way, the hundreds of billions of dollars in grants that are currently being frozen, much of that was awarded to state agencies, which is why it was state attorneys generals that filed. It was 18, I believe, or 24 state attorneys generals that filed the legal case against the administration because they have billions and billions and billions of dollars that are frozen right now. Again, awards awarded to them that they would typically pass through to other entities. All right, let's see if there are any other questions. We're going to take just one more. So Yvonne's question, your thoughts on the upcoming March 15th? This is the day after the continuing resolution expires. That's a great point. Potentially leading to a government shutdown or deep discretionary funding cuts. How do organizations prepare?
Oh, uh, I'll defer to you on this first, Patrice, as I gather my thoughts on this extremely important but difficult question.
Well, the only thing I would add to that is I believe that because Congress is pretty much stacked in one party, I don't see them allowing a government shutdown to happen unless unless the decision is to use that government shutdown as a tool of some sort, some kind of political tool. But I feel like they already have all the political tools at their disposal. I don't see that happening. But that could be, that's an excellent question. That could be uh, reason for some other things, some other cuts to potentially happen. And so, and also the new budget. So I would definitely pay very, very close attention to that. And I know I will certainly do that to make sure that I can keep our community up to date on what has happened and what to expect. So that's.
Yeah, and I would just dovetail off of that. If you have
Mhm.
a project officer, reach out to them now. I know that certain level of communication from some of these agencies has been limited or stopped. But this would be the time to start doing some contingency planning. As I said, reach out to a project officer, anybody in the government or in the office where you have that money coming from to talk about their thoughts on contingency planning. Reach out to your representatives, your Congress, everybody that you can to bring this issue to light. It is a valid concern. And we have really received no word from anybody. So my suggestion is start knocking on doors, writing emails, talking to people, and get that out there before March 15th.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I thank you all. So quite a few have asked whether slides will be available. Yes, we will be sending the recording to those of you who registered. So you can definitely look for that. I do also want to let you know that we did drop in the chat the link for you to schedule some time with our team to talk about your grant writing needs or even your grant management needs. Again, that is something that we also specialize in. Thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate your comment. And Jackie, thank you, Jackie, Dorothy, Alice, Runke. Thank you so much for joining. And
Patrice, may I just interject one more thing here?
sure, sure,
Um,
absolutely.
I really would encourage you and your staff out there in some of these areas that we discussed today, whether it was the need or your sustainability or looking at outcomes in language, to start now really thinking about how you're going to start recrafting your language. It is going to require rethinking and reframing how you've presented your proposals before. And there is no time like the present to start taking these terms and saying, what are we going to call this? How do we start talking about our program in more often economic impact terms? Who do we go if you can't talk about return on investment clearly at this point? Who can you seek out to maybe help you think that? A lot of times, and I saw this in the chat, universities can be very helpful in that regard. This is the time to start talking to people about how you can better position your organization to respond to these proposals when they come out.
Yeah, absolutely. Partnerships with universities too, beyond that. Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. All right. Well, thank you all again for joining us and spending a part of your day. Please reach out to GrantsWorks for any of your federal grant needs. Thanks again to Alice. Awesome
Thank
job,
you.
Alice. Appreciate it. And it looks like a lot of people also appreciate the information you shared. Have a wonderful rest of the day and, of course, a wonderful weekend. And thanks again for joining GrantsWorks.
Thank you all.
All righty.
Bye-bye.
Bye. I'm going to